Hi, Dr. Lou Pulsfer here. I'm starting a series called The Nature of Games, where I pose a spectrum with two polar opposites that is fundamental to the nature of games. And this time I'm going to talk about fundamental game format, functional format versus cosmetic format. Now, what am I talking about? Well, game format is whether a game is a tabletop board game, a tabletop card game, a tabletop RPG, a video game with a great variety of choices there, such as genres or platforms. Platforms being console, PC, tablet, handheld, virtual reality, and so forth. Insofar as you can program a board game on a computer, or program a card game on a computer, or take something on a computer that is fundamentally a board game or fundamentally a card game and turn it into a tabletop game, then this format difference I've just been talking about is more cosmetic than real. Functional differences are ones that affect actual play. Cosmetic differences only affect appearance and perhaps convenience. Whether a game is physically a card game, a board game, or a video game is a cosmetic difference. It's like the difference between a man dressed in drag and an actual woman, or a woman dressed to look like a man. Cosmetically, the man dressed in drag looks like a woman. Cosmetically, the woman dressed to look like a man looks like a man, but functionally, they haven't changed. We've just altered their appearance to essentially to fool people. I'm interested in the functions of games, not so much the cosmetics, although cosmetics matter as well. Many people don't see beyond the cosmetics. For example, I have a vaguely Stratego-like space war game that is being programmed for the PC. Now, it's a board game, and it'll be a board game even when it can be played on a PC. There are fundamental factors that make this so, and that's the actual topic for today. What are those fundamental factors that make a board game, or a card game, or whatever, a video game? And we're going to find, for example, that many of the so-called board games are really something else, which I might call status tracking games or record/status games that don't actually need a board at all and don't use a board for the purposes that boards have traditionally been used for. So, go back to the beginning. Why do boards exist in games? If you think of classic, that is pre-commercial board games, such as backgammon, chess, nine men's Morris, Mancala, Go, drafts, or checkers, even tic-tac-toe, the board exists to depict maneuver or placement or both, and spatial relationships. Practically speaking, there's no other way to show maneuver and spatial relationships other than a board. That's what boards are for. So typically a board game depicts either racing or a conflict, whether that conflict is warfare or gangs fighting with each other, something that involves fighting. In almost every case. I can't think of an exception. Backgammon has conflict, but it's mostly a racing game. Mancala is mostly a racing game. But most of the games I've listed there are more or less war games. Nowadays, however, we have many modern games that use some paper or cardboard thing in the middle of the table as a status tracker, not a field for spatial relationships. Where are my workers being placed, for example? These are called board games because your typical game player doesn't think about functional differences. They only think about how things look. And so they're called board games. But if you think about it, many people lump card games in with board games and call them board games. They are not very good at differentiating things. But what these status tracking games are games that do not require boards. There are a variety of ways to track status. For example, you can depict worker placement on a piece of cardboard, or you can do it with cards, or you can do it with tokens of some other kind. Now, some people might suggest that any status tracking game that isn't primarily cards must be a board game. They might say a board for maneuver replacement and spatial relationships is just tracking a different status than the other status tracking boards. I don't think so. I think that spatial relationships are much different than the typical things that are tracked on the status tracking boards that are typical in games these days. And so I separate the two, and history is on my side, more or less. But some people are not going to agree with me, and then they may not accept the rest of what I'm saying. Of course, sometimes in modern games, modern tabletop games, cards are used as status trackers rather than boards. But after all, cards are things that keep track of a status in a sense, but hide the information generally. And to me, a resource management game or a worker placement game is fundamentally different from a war or racing game. Among other things, there tends not to be much active opposition in the former, and there is in the latter. Although in a racing game, often it cannot be exerted. So, let's step over to something else. What's fundamental about card games? As I said, hidden information. Board games naturally reveal all. The board is there to show the spatial relationship. That's what it's for. Card games naturally hide almost all the information in a very simple way. You hold on to cards in your hand, you can see them, other people can't. Or the cards are placed on a table and they're face down. Or if the card game has been programmed, it amounts to the same thing. The player can see what he has. Things that are on the table can hold a place there, but nobody can see it, and so forth. Now, card games also provide more flexibility for a varying number of players than board games do. If you think of those pre-commercial games, they're almost all two-player games. Board games are fundamentally limited by the size and shape of the board because that board is necessary to play. You could play Risk with 8 players if you provide extra pieces, but the board's really too small for that. You can also play Risk with 2 players, but then the board's kind of too big. It works, but it's not entirely satisfactory. People who design games to be played on boards discover that sometimes for more players you need a bigger board. I have a couple of prototypes where the standard board will work for up to 5, but if you want to play with 6 or 7, you need to use a bigger board, and I provide one on the other side of the board. You turn it over. Now, racing games are a little bit different because you only have one piece. In effect, a racing game is an avatar game because you just have that one piece. And because you just have that one piece, a racing game can accommodate lots of players. The maneuver is very constrained. It's constrained by the track. If you tried to have a racing game where you could go every which way, then it would be more difficult to have a large number of players. Number of players also involves downtime. This is a little bit of a digression, but I think it's worth saying. Card and racing games take little time per player. Card games because you've just got a few cards you can play. Racing games because you've got that avatar-like vehicle or horse or whatever it is. Conflict games often take much longer per player because there are a lot more pieces involved and a lot more locations involved. So if you have a large number of players, for example 8, then you end up with an awful lot of downtime. And downtime is very much frowned upon these days, and at some point that makes a lot of sense. Of course, we do have some games for a large number of players. Diplomacy is a 7-player game, and there are variants of diplomacy for an even larger number of players. But in diplomacy, everybody is acting at the same time. It's simultaneous negotiation, simultaneous movement, so you don't have the turn basis where you create the downtime for the players. Okay, now what about video games? Well, video games, even more than card games, hide information. By their very nature, the program doesn't show anything to the player unless the programmers choose to do that. Now, video games are also really good at complex calculation, but that's a relatively minor thing, actually, because people have calculators. You can have a board game and people do calculations, or have what's essentially a board game and have an app that does some calculations. But even more important than these aspects of video games by their nature can keep track of many things invisibly that would be difficult or impossible to track in a physical game. So record keeping, which is a part of status tracking, is natural to video games. And we could make an argument that it's the most fundamental aspect of video games, with hidden information and calculation not too far behind. The difference between record keeping and status tracking here is status tracking shows the status to the other players, whereas the records may be hidden so only one player or maybe no players can see it. And video games, of course, do both excellently well. So in a sense, if costs were not wildly different, it would make more sense for all those status tracking / record keeping games to be video games. You wouldn't have to fiddle around with lots of cubes and cards because the computer would keep track for you. Unfortunately, in a practical aspect, programming and computers to run programs on cost a lot of money. So they're not as satisfactory as a physical game. They also lack the tactile feel, the haptic aspect of physical games. And finally, computer games generally lack the social interaction of face-to-face gaming. Although I think a future, if not something that's already existing in games, is a game that is programmed, but every player has their own tablet, and so they all see the same display, except that things can be shown only to them on their own tablet. The tablet almost becomes a set of cards, but it's a lot more than that, of course. If a game like that does not exist, I'm sure that it will pretty soon, and then you can sit there face to face and play much like you would nowadays with a tabletop game. So when I spoke in another screencast about the demise of board games, I was talking in the fundamental sense, not that what we call board games are going away, but that board games that require a board are going away. They don't seem to be popular. Many people simply do not play games that involve maneuver, that involve spatial relationships, so the two go together. If you walk around someplace like Prototype Con in Kissimmee, Florida, which I was at the other day, you don't see many games that involve spatial relationships. What you see is a whole lot of status tracking and record keeping games. So, video games are the natural format for these kinds of games. Now, of course, you can also have war games and racing games in a video format, and often they are called board game-like when you do that. So, the upshot of all this is that a board game is a board game because you need the board to show the spatial relationships. Not because it's convenient for showing status, not because it's cardboard and sits in the middle of a table. So we would be better off saying something like a board game in tabletop form or a board game in video form, and refer to the card games as card games rather than board games, rather than lumping them together. You could make a case that Civilization 4 is both a board game and a status tracking record keeping game in video format, but it's definitely a board game because maneuver and geospatial relationships locations are very important. Once again though, so many people say board game when they actually mean a card game. Semantics are a low priority with players. I attend North Carolina State Tabletop Game Group, and we have had as many as 84 people attend a session, and typically 40 some, and it's not unusual for me to walk around and look at what people are playing, and even though we talk about being board gamers, almost all the games are card games. And once again, card games are different from board games. You can take a set of cards and use it to show some maneuver and spatial relationships, and I have done it, and it is interesting, but it's not naturally the way card games work. Card games naturally do not involve maneuver or spatial relationships because there's no board. Now, let's take a recent example. I said I was at Prototype Con recently. I saw a 3-player World War II prototype tabletop board game by Mark Gelston. And I have seen prettier prototypes, but I've never seen one that required so much time and effort from the designer to make it. And I have a photo on the next slide. There are lots of cubes with stickers on them, handmade displays with insets to hold the cubes, nice cards, lots of small pieces of wood to keep track of things. I talked with Mark for a long time and found that the game models many significant aspects of World War II that are often ignored in World War II games. Unfortunately, it would cost more than $200 to produce, certainly in the small print runs that are typical of war games today. To me, this is naturally a computer game, not a board game, because of all the things that have to be tracked. Now, here is the photograph. This is a 6-foot long table, and you see it fills the table. So we have dozens upon dozens of cubes with stickers on each side of the cube. Some of them are elongated cubes with stickers on each side of the cube. We have lots of discs. We have rectangles, wooden ones with stickers on both sides. There's an awful lot of status tracking here, as well as a board that provides for maneuver and placement and geospatial relationships. So it can be done as a board game. It is naturally a board game for the most part, but also in some sense it's naturally a computer game. So, functional versus cosmetic. You have to think about the purpose of things to understand the fundamental functions. Don't let the appearance deceive you. Thanks for listening.